Good evening. My name is Toby Tichton-Back, and I'm the director of the Holocaust Resource Center in Buffalo. This evening, our guest is Marianne Goldstein. Marianne was born in Germany, and she's going to tell us her story. But Marianne, when did you get to the United States?
We arrived in the United States on August 16th, 1939. Imagine, that's just 2 weeks before the invasion by Germany of Poland. And really that was most fortunate for us because we couldn't have arrived any later. We could have only arrived earlier. But we didn't have the wisdom or the foresight that things would come to such a state.
How did you manage to get out?
Well, that's a long story.
Well, let's hear your story.
First, I'll tell you a little bit about my family and what my father did. We lived in Pirmasens, which is in the Palatinate region. That's Western Germany, near the Saarland, actually not too far from the French border. I was the youngest of 4 children. I have 3 brothers. We're all about a year and a half difference in age. And so in 1939, I was a young girl of 12 and a half. My oldest brother was 16. We really never thought much about leaving Germany, but
you were comfortable there.
We thought it would pass.
Well,
but my father was a rabbi in the city of Pirmasens.
We have a picture of him. Perhaps you can tell us exactly what he did.
He was a rabbi of a congregation, about 300 people in the congregation.
Oh, there is the picture.
And he was the rabbi of that city and also of a district surrounding that city, so that encompassed a great many smaller towns where he went for the ritual and ceremonies and holiday visits.
You had a comfortable home?
So we lived in a nice big apartment, and until 35 or 36, when the racial laws came out, my mom always had a housekeeper, a household help with her 4 children. And really, my father worried about what would happen to us, because even in 1934, there were possibilities to consider sending one or the other of your children into another country in order to establish a foothold there.
That was the first time they had Aliyah to Palestine, too, in
those years, yes, because a stepbrother of my mother actually did make Aliyah in 36. We've visited him in Israel since then. But when the first thoughts came up about sending a child to the United States or anywhere in 1934, just, a year after Hitler came to power, my father thought of one of my brothers, the middle brother, by the name of Gerhard, and all the relatives, got all excited. Why are you sending, a 10-year-old child away? How can you do such a cruel thing, and all this will blow over?
Were conditions so bad that your father thought it was wise to send your brother?
Well, the conditions in 34 were such that already school children were being thrown stones at, and there were street fights with the children, There was a lot of anti-Semitism, and it seemed to be the wisdom, and it turned out to be a wise thing. My father let himself be convinced that he was too young, and so my brother didn't go in 34, but he was sent to the United States in a children's transport in 1936. Maybe I'm getting a little ahead of my story. So maybe others, he went over in 1936, and I'll come back to that.
Fine.
But we'll come back to the fact that my father was a rabbi, and that we didn't really think about leaving the country again until November 9th, Crystal Night, in the morning after.
1938.
In 1938, November 1938.
We have a picture of this. This is your father's synagogue?
This is my father's synagogue.
What happened to it?
On the morning after the Crystal Night, my father and my younger brother and I walked up there and found that it was totally destroyed.
Totally destroyed.
The roof was gone, and the windows were broken, and there had been a conflagration there. And my father was able to go inside and pull out a Torah. I don't remember, what condition it was in, but he brought it home, and we walked back with him. By the time he got home, he was arrested, and shortly after that, in the afternoon, all his books and the Torah ritual objects were confiscated. And then we realized that other men, most other Jewish men and teenage boys had also been arrested. Fortunately for my youngest brother, who was then 14, he was downstairs in the basement, and I think my mother had just sent us to play there because she wanted us out of the way. She worried about us. And this whole group of men and teenagers were taken to Dachau. They had to walk for miles until they got to a railroad station, and then they were transported to Dachau, where most of them stayed for some 6 to 8 weeks.
How long was your father incarcerated?
My father was there about 6 weeks, and the only reason you see, the final solution hadn't been planned. The final solution really was planned around 41, 42.
Yes,
so at this time, they really weren't it was like a warning, get out, Jews. And since they apparently didn't have any intention of keeping the Jews in Dachau, that they had rounded up forever, at that point, they dismissed the men who had been in World War II, some who had earned the Iron Cross. My father had been a chaplain, a Jewish chaplain in World War I. And so they were dismissed. The youngsters of 15, 16 were the last to be dismissed. And it just, it was December. This is November, December.
Did you hear
very
from your
cold.
father?
And yes, we did hear from him. He wrote cards home, and
we have a picture of,
yes,
of one of the cards.
Postcard.
So perhaps you could tell us what the card.
See, it says concentration
Dachau.
camp Dachau, and underneath is the conditions under which my mother could write a postcard. If she received a postcard from my father, or if he wrote a letter, then she would be permitted to send him a letter, and that she could also send him 15 marks a week, which, according to my father, really came in very handy to bribe the guards a little bit. But it was a very, very hard life there. They were made to stand in the cold and in the snow in December at 5, 6 in the morning for hours on time.
And for the roll call.
And the roll call, and some of the young people who were dismissed last came with frozen toes and lost a toe.
How did your father return?
They had to wear prison garb, and there was a picture of him in prison garb and hair shorn. He was emaciated, but he was all right.
So that was quite a warning.
From concentration camp, then he wrote to my mother to do everything possible to get us a visa to leave Germany. And that takes me back to my brother, whom, my parents decided in '36 that this was the 12-year-old who was most appealing and most self-sufficient and getting into the most street fights with the,
with the German
Deutsche Jugend, the German
here's a picture
children.
of your brother.
And so that was my brother just before he left Germany.
What's his name?
This is my brother Gerhard, and he was 12, and just before he left, he had a bar mitzvah in Germany, and then after he came here, he had another bar mitzvah with his new family.
It was very courageous of a little boy to leave his family. Do you ever talk about his feelings?
And I think also very traumatic for the parents.
And for the parents, too, to
and in
send
fact,
the child away.
It's amazing that to think that because of the difficulties of getting even the non-quota visas to let children, leave Germany and Central Europe, there were only 397 children who were actually admitted to the United States between
in the year of
34 and 39.
Oh, in 5 years. I thought that was each year.
No, in 5 years.
Only 397.
A German-Jewish Hilfsverein der Deutschen Juden, the umbrella organization for German Jewry, made arrangements to contact the Jewish federations in the United States, and there was a German Jewish Children's Aid Society of social workers that found families, and there were thousands of families who were willing and
more families
would have been
children.
willing to take in 1 or 2 children. And so a German Jewish social worker would go on the boat with these children in groups of 12 to 14 children.
From Germany to the United States.
And most of the children were under 14 and 15. There were very few older ones. On the boat, they would teach them a little English and how to, understand American life, if you will, and get along with their new families. And then they arrived in New York. He arrived in New York on July 31st, 1936.
You'll always remember that, I'm sure.
Yes, and on August 1st, he and 3 other children were picked up by a family from Indiana. And he was to be taken to Chicago. One of the other children was to be dropped off in Baltimore. And 2 children, maybe there were 5 children, 2 children were to go with the family that they had signed up for. Now, as it turned out, one of the children was very Orthodox and wanted to go with an Orthodox family. My brother had come over without having been spoken for.
Oh.
Okay, they were going to find him a family after he got here. And as it turned out, the family by the name of Bloomberg, Benjamin Bloomberg from Terre Haute, Indiana, dropped my brother off in Chicago, where he stayed at a sort of a sheltering, maybe the highest sheltering orphanage, something like that. And they found a home for the very Orthodox child, and then they came back and picked up my brother because they really got to like him.
Oh, and
so
he liked
found
them?
home and he liked them.
And were there children in the home?
There were 4 children already. This was a very well-to-do family, very involved with the Jewish community.
Gerhard's
oh, the
age?
children, they adopted, well, they took in 2 children. It wasn't really a formal adoption. They took in 2 children, and they had 4 of their own.
It was very hospitable, very magnanimous.
Right.
2 children at the same time? Or
at the same time.
So he had a playmate who spoke German in the beginning?
Who came on with the same group.
And how many years did he actually stay? Oh, until you
he
came?
Was there, no, well, he was there from 36 to 39, and we came in 39. But in the fall of 39, he was already admitted to Harvard University. It's amazing how quickly.
He was 16,
got acclimatized. He was young, and he won a scholarship to Harvard, so he did very well.
Did he write to you? Did you get mail from him?
Yes, all the time we had.
And it was a good experience for him?
And he was happy, and the family was a very lovely family.
Is he still in touch with that family?
He's in touch with them, very much so.
And you've met them too?
I've met them. They've come to a wedding of a niece, the son who lives in New York. And
that's a happy story. Tell us about the rest of the family back in Germany while he's here.
As I say, it was fortunate for us that we did send him then in 36, because the very next day, as I said, my father and all the other Jewish men were taken to a concentration camp, and they wrote immediately to their wives saying that we have to get out of Germany. Hitler at that time had no interest in keeping Jews there. He only had interest in getting rid of them, making the country Judenfreien, and keeping the property and possessions, So the very next day, my mother cabled to the United States, to the Bloomberg family in Terre Haute, Indiana. And Mr. Bloomberg set all the wheels in motion to try to get us out, and he learned really that under the circumstances, a quota number would have been meaningless because it was much too late and the quotas were all exhausted. So that he found out, however, that ministers, rabbis, could, if they had a sponsor and a congregational sponsor, that they could...
In other words, a job waiting.
A job waiting for them as a minister, because they needed a rabbi. So that job, the congregation made out an affidavit to bring my father.
So did he find a congregation from his city, from Terre Haute?
From Terre Haute, Indiana. He was to be the assistant rabbi there.
And he manipulated that, he managed it.
But looking over some of the documents just recently, I had never realized, because my father passed away in '81, and I brought some of the documentation that he had kept home with me. I first found out how many letters he wrote to Washington and to congressmen and senators
before
and people, this Mr. Bloomberg,
Mr. Bloomberg,
in order to pressure them to make the United States Immigration Naturalization Service, extend a visa and send it to the American consul in Germany so that we would get a visa.
How long did it actually
here.
take from
It took from the November 9th, if you will, when my mother first canceled, until August 1939. Around the end of July of '39, we actually got our passports
we have a picture of your Risa pass that permitted you to leave.
Right.
And in the passport,
yes,
this is your mother's.
You
want to tell us about that?
And if you look closely, you see that her first name is Minna, but then in the middle, her middle name after Kristallnacht became Sarah, and our family name was Nellhouse. So it's Minna, Sarah, Nellhouse. All the women had to register again in their respective cities after Kristallnacht to receive this middle identifying name.
So every Jewish woman in Germany was Sarah. What happened to the men?
Right. And all the men became Israel.
Israel.
Yes.
So they lost, this is the first hint of loss of identity before they actually lose it in camps.
An absolute command to appear at the city clerks and register as a Jew.
Were you already wearing yellow stars?
No.
No, that wasn't mandated.
I think that started probably after the invasion of Poland and the, ghetto systems.
Now, what do you remember of those years specifically? Oh, yes. What happened to your schooling during this time?
Well, in '38, at the time of the Kristallnacht, actually, I was attending a girls'
public
Latin school, a gymnasium,
a high school.
Lyceum, yes. And in the European system means that you go to public school for 4 years and then you take an exam and you can go to a high school. And from that day on, Jewish children couldn't attend public schools anymore, or German schools.
Let me backtrack a little bit.
Yeah.
While you were in the public school, did you experience anything negative because you were Jewish?
Well, one of the most awkward times for me always were when I would sit in the hall while the other children would have religious instruction.
Oh,
it wasn't even a choice of sitting in on the non-Jewish religious instruction. It was almost like sit out there so that we can all recognize you and separate you as a Jew. And then, of course, at recess time when we'd go down into the yard to play, I very often found myself alone, and the children would throw stones.
So you were discriminated against?
Yes, I was said before, the children in my brother's school. My brother went to a gymnasium. My brother Gerhard, particularly, they were always fighting with him, and he came home with bloody noses. And he was, an aggressive and energetic
and he
kid,
stood up for his rights.
Stood up for himself. So that my father, I think that's why my parents decided that that was the son that was going to, be the pioneer to a new land.
Now, what about the teachers? Were they fair to the Jewish students?
I don't remember that I really experienced a lot of anti-Semitism from the teacher. I do remember one occasion when a teacher asked me to mail a letter for her, and this was already in '37, '38, and this was on a Friday, and I realized on Sunday night that I hadn't mailed the letter yet, and I spent such a terribly sleepless night wondering all kinds of terrible things that were going to happen to me as a result.
But you never told her that it wasn't mailed?
I never told her.
But you mailed it.
But when you're small, you worry about these
everything
things.
Takes different proportions.
Right.
So you had to leave that school. What kind of school did you go to afterward? You said
Okay, then there was a Kristallnacht, and in the first 4 years of schooling, then before you would enter gymnasium, all the Jewish children had been instructed by one teacher, a Jewish teacher, in the public school, but in a separate room. This teacher had from 1st to 8th grade in one little classroom, you see, and he was taken to concentration camp also. And when he came back, he gave instruction in his own house, and by that time there were fewer children still, maybe just about 20 children that were left. And in between, my mother, until he came back, and even the summer before, my mother had sent me to a Catholic sister sewing school.
Oh, so you learned a new skill.
Even that was an interesting experience, because the Catholic sisters were not so sure of their position in the Nazi system, and there were periodic visits by the SS.
Did that affect you personally?
And not personally, but you know, you were affected, because I knew, I was, you know, from the time the Hitler came to power in '33, when I was 6 years old already, until we left when I was 12, you know, I was aware at all times from conversations and from seeing the SS and SA parading up and down the street. I remember distinctly their singing, especially on Friday night, you know, Erev Shabbos. I think they purposely walked down the street in front of our house and sang.
Did you live in a
this
Jewish
familiar
neighborhood?
When the Jewish blood spurts from the knife, you know.
Oh, dear.
It wasn't, no, because the city was, there were only 300 Jewish families, and they, you know, lived, and there was only this one synagogue.
And of course, you have images of their boots. Everyone talks about boots.
Of their boots, and that we lived in an apartment and in a house where there were several other apartments. And upstairs from us, there was a family with a son in the SS in Hitler's personal guard, and a daughter who also regularly had attend, you know, the Jewish women, the Nazi women's meeting.
Groups.
The parents always saying, well, we don't know anything about that. Our son has to do this, you know. And of course, you could never quite trust them, though. I would visit there sometimes, because the parents, you know, always let me visit. But it became, as I became 10 years old, you know, in 37, 38, I stopped going up there.
You yourself realized,
yeah, I was very uncomfortable.
That it wasn't
very uncomfortable with that, right? But
now, this school teacher, did that teacher survive? The teacher who?
I don't know.
And what about grandparents and uncles and aunts?
I don't know whether he survived. Some of the young people that were in that concentration camp are now in the United States, and just when my father passed away and there was an announcement in the German Jewish Aufbau in New York, an announcement of a death notice, then I received letters from
the
many
people that were
people
in Dachau with your
that
father?
were in Dachau with my father, and families, you know, from Pirmasens, where he was the rabbi. And you asked about survivors. It was a small family. My father had a brother who, in '34, when my father first thought of sending a child over to the United States, you know, threw up his hands and said, I wouldn't do that. I have a daughter. I'm not going to send her away. She's the same age. How can you be so cruel? And what kind of a parent are you? And things are going to blow over, you know. And this brother and his wife and the daughter I just referred to, in '41, just in the nick of time, at the latest possible moment, were able to buy tickets to get to Italy. And then from Italy, they were able to get passage to Shanghai.
So they were just very lucky, very fortunate.
What, 800 families or so that were in Shanghai until 47, 48, at which time we were then able to bring them over here.
But if they had sent the daughter to America like your brother, they would have gotten a sponsor like you did.
Not necessarily.
Oh, no, because your father was the rabbi.
Because by 38, 39, I mean, I think in 35, 36, there was enough of a quota for Germans, you know, actually not for Jews, but for Germans to come to the United States. But by 38, 39, it was totally exhausted. So they came over.
What about your mother?
My mother, the only grandparent that was alive at the time, we were in 39 before we left Germany, was my mother's mother, and she was sickly, and she had been living in a home for the elderly, a non-denominational home. And in 41 we received a Red Cross notice that she was no longer alive.
So she
which is a little
spared.
suspicious. It's suspicious because why would the Red Cross have informed us rather than the home?
Oh, I see, I see.
Okay.
That's why you were
So my mother was always suspicious of that. My mother also had a brother living in Berlin, and he was married, they had no children, and I remember that in 39, shortly after we arrived here, they wrote that they were leaving Germany because they were going to work in a labor camp.
Oh, did they survive?
They didn't survive.
Oh.
No.
Do you have any information about
No
them?
information whatsoever.
So obviously they died
then she
there.
had a younger brother who was a youngster of 14, 15 in 1936, and he made Aliyah to Israel.
Oh, that was the stepbrother
Yes,
that you
that was the
referred
stepbrother,
to?
right. My oldest brother, at the time that my father was taken to Dachau, if he had been home, would have probably been looked for and taken with them. But at the same time that my brother Gerhard was sent to the United States, my father made a decision for the oldest brother, who was 14 then, to send him to a horticultural school to prepare him for Aliyah to Israel.
Is that where he went?
He was in Hanover, in Ahlem, that was the name of the school, in Hanover then, at the time that Kristallnacht occurred, and that saved his life, possibly, certainly saved him a frozen toes.
What happened to your brother ultimately?
When we got permission to leave Germany, he was included.
Oh, I see. So he went with you.
Three children, there were three of us came with our parents, and he came with us, and he really was the first one to get a job here.
Because he was older already.
Yeah. Actually, what happened is, not only did my father have an offer of a job in Terre Haute, Indiana, let's say whether it was partially a fictional or not is really important, but a second job offer was also available to him in Haverhill, Massachusetts. So when we came off the boat, you know, we thought we were going to meet Mr. Bloomberg and be taken to Terre Haute, Indiana, and instead we were met by a Mr. Engel from Haverhill, Massachusetts, who explained to my father that he was a friend of Mr. Bloomberg and had been delegated to receive us and to take us to Haverhill, Massachusetts.
That's where you went?
And that's where we went, because each one of us, that brings me to an interesting point. There was no choice to make a decision, well, let's stay in New York for a while, since the German government took all your property away, all your savings, all your insurance.
Did you come with anything?
They left you with nothing except enough money that was deposited into a bank to pay for the tickets, and 10 marks per person, which was approximately $5. So my father had $25 total for the three of us and the two of them.
Did he manage to take any jewelry?
I was thinking about that. Presumably, for $25 in 39, you could have maybe stayed overnight, a few nights, and gotten in touch with the Hayas or the National Council or another Jewish organization. But he didn't protest. We were met by a very nice gentleman and with a big car that was just, you know, amazing to us to travel in such a big car, and he took us to Haverhill. You asked?
Oh, whether your father could bring anything like jewelry with him?
No, you couldn't. You were not allowed, and that brings up another interesting story. Before we went on boat, were
you searched? In
Bremerhaven, that's where we entered the boat. We were not searched very carefully, but they took my mother in and made her undress completely, and she had lovely hair that she wore in upsweep, and they made her put her hair down, and they examined her inside out, top to bottom. And really, the whistle had already blown, and she was the last person to get on board. And it was a terribly upsetting experience. Right. It was certainly one that she never forgot. She really had gone through a great deal. You know. So then we came here and settled in Haverhill, Massachusetts, and
was your father really the rabbi?
My father's English left something to be desired, so what they had decided to do is Mr. Bloomberg and Mr. Engel, that he should go for some brush-up work on his English and some courses on how to deal with American congregations, if you will, to the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. My father had been a liberal conservative rabbi in Germany, and he did go there for a few weeks.
So he was separated from the family?
Yes.
And who took care of your mother and you? Was it
well, Mr. Engel found a little apartment for us, and a friend of his owned a hardware store, and my oldest brother, who was then 16, started working in the hardware store, and he was really the provider. And
did you go to school right away?
And I started school right away. My brother Martin went to
Was
school.
that hard for you? Do you remember?
Well, all I remember is that we both were put into first grade.
Oh, that must have been shocking.
Well, both of us had a little English for about 6 months, you know, before we came, because in Germany, in every community, there was some English being taught for immigration, you know.
But you were already 12 years old or so, and here you were with the little ones.
So we were with the little ones, and the teachers were just wonderful. They spent time after school. It's the children who weren't wonderful, you know, because you stood in line and, you know, for the doors to open to go to school, and they would say, "Where do you come from?" And say, "Germany." And then they say, "Oh, you're German?" And believe it or not, in '39, there was a great deal of respect for Germans. You know, they weren't thought of as Nazis. They were thought of as, you know, people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. You know, anyway,
from the Depression.
It was better during that period. It was almost better when you came to the United States to say you're German than a Jew. But when you said, "But I'm Jewish," "Oh, you're Jewish."
Were there any other Jews in this little town? Oh, there must have been.
Yes,
Mr. Engel was there.
Yes, there were two or three.
I keep thinking of your mother. It must have been so difficult to manage.
For her too.
A new
she
home,
had little
new language.
English. My brother and I jumped from 1st to 7th grade in the same year.
In the same year.
Very precocious.
Well.
And you know, from then on it was smooth sailing.
And then your father came back?
My father came back and had opportunities to become a rabbi for German Jewish congregations in New Jersey and New York, because by that time there were you know, several thousand immigrants who had established their own little societies and congregations.
I think there was one near Vineland.
He really somehow didn't want to do that. So we lived in Haverhill, and he worked in the Plymouth Rubber Company. I remember the owner, a man by the name of Walter Beringer, who did a great many wonderful things for immigrants. He worked there and folded cartons and worked very hard at it. I got a job one summer and stitched sheets. They made sheets and rubber sheets for babies. But my father would go into Boston, because Haverhill was only about an hour and a half by train from Boston, and he got in touch with the National Council of Jewish Women and the Vocational Services and became acquainted with some of the rabbis. And so when he was offered a job as a bar mitzvah teacher in Temple Kellis, Israel, in Brookline.
In Brookline. So you moved to Brookline then?
We moved to Roxbury.
Oh, so you had a more normal kind of life.
And in Boston, my parents felt much more comfortable because they were German Jewish families, and there was a rather large immigrant mutual aid society. My father conducted their services, and he officiated at weddings and
How many years
funerals.
were you in Haverhill?
So we lived in Haverhill from '39 to '42. And then we moved to Boston, and then he became an assistant librarian at the Hebrew Teachers College. Maybe that's why I've got to be a librarian.
Oh, maybe it was that wonderful positive
But he worked very hard. Things were very hard. You know, the $10, $12 you earned in 1939, you know, we all worked hard. My brother got a corner with newspapers right after we got here in '39. I babysat the rabbi's children. At that time, you babysat a week for 40 cents an afternoon and 50 cents an evening, and you did the diapers Sunday morning.
And the dishes besides.
It was a difficult time.
But you all pitched in, and
everybody pitched in, and we were very grateful to be here.
And you were together,
and couldn't realize how, you know, you could sometimes, you couldn't even begin to realize that you had made a trip over this vast ocean that put you, you know,
into another culture,
into another world, into freedom. It was unbelievable. You could never really believe it.
Did you know
sometimes even now I don't believe it.
Did you know what was going on back in Europe?
Not really any more than
anybody
the papers
else
showed,
right.
You know.
So it was quite a shock for you in '45 too.
Because we really, you know, after 40, we really didn't hear from anyone except for these, you know, brief message from Red Cross, postcard written by my uncle that they were going into a labor camp.
And really did your brother Gerhard come to join you?
My brother Gerhard, in '39, it was time for him to enter college, and went to Harvard. And he had interesting experiences. I'm just reminded that he told me that just last year, a young man by the name of Peter Block, he was the Orthodox child that I talked about that didn't want to go with the family, but he took it upon himself to try to gather the 14 kids.
Did he? Did he manage?
And he was able, through the U.S. Immigration Service, to get a list of the children that came that year, and he identified the children, and he got a great many of them together.
Did your brother go?
My brother didn't go, but one of the brothers of the sons of the family that he lived with between '36 and '39, because there was another young man by the name of Heinz, who had gone to he decided to go so that he would meet some of the children that he had met coming off the boat.
That's wonderful that was managed.
Very interesting. And I think my brother, you know, was very fond of that family. They took good care of him. It's just a shame that we couldn't have allowed, you know, that the United States couldn't have allowed.
No, I always thought that number was for five years.
400 children. Then in '38, the Wagner, in '39 actually, after Crystal Night, there was the Wagner bill by Senator Wagner to try to get 20,000 German Jewish children, although it was phrased German children, to come to this country so that it wouldn't just be Jewish children, but any children that
needed a haven. So how many actually came?
And none, the bill never came through. So after '39, it was just, there were no more. Yeah.
That could have been.
Yeah. And there was an organization called the German Jewish Children's Aid Society, made up of social workers from this country, who, under the umbrella of the Jewish federations, followed up how well the children were doing, you know, and if they were taken care of, you know, and if they were happy. And they reported, you know, and Wagner also, you know, used that as proof that it was a good thing to do. They reported that the children were all doing fine and that they were not disturbed particularly by the separation from the family, and that 2 or 3 who had come when they were, you know, close to working age were already working and able to earn their own living.
So if that had gone through, so many would have been saved. And it took several years until they were brought. I think there were some 900 who were brought to Oswego, but only 900.
Oh, when was that?
That was, I believe that was 1944.
1944.
1943, but a very small number.
I don't know whether I mentioned it, that a social worker from Germany, a Jewish social worker, accompanied the children on board. I mentioned that, yeah.
So that part of your life is behind you, and since then you've been to Russia. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I feel when I went to Russia, I happened to have the opportunity to go on a study seminar for 6 weeks, and even though I didn't have any addresses, I wanted to meet some Russian Jews, and I went to the synagogues, and particularly in Moscow, I went to the synagogue and met an elderly lady there who whispered into my ear that after she found out I was from Buffalo, and we tried to converse in a little Yiddish, but very unobtrusively, because on my right sat this Jewish KGB lady.
How did you know that she was KGB?
I could tell because she came to another section of the women's gallery to bring me to this section, because that's where she wanted me to. She wanted all the visitors to sit there. There was a Canadian rabbi's wife.
She wanted to snoop.
She wanted to snoop, and she was very insistent about my staying to the end of the service, that she could show me how to, show me the mikveh, and then how to get to the subway. She really wanted to keep, with me, stay with me. And this lady, whom I call Fanny, left early, but she whispered a phone number in my ear. And I called her later. And then she told me a story that her in-laws, elderly people, lived in Buffalo, and that their only son and wife and family were in Moscow.
And she was the wife? Was she the wife of the...
No, she was the mother-in-law.
Oh, she was the mother-in-law.
Yeah, she was the mother-in-law. And the phone call then set up meetings between us. And to this day, I visit the son's parents here. They're old. The mother is blind. And since '79, they had every expectation that the children would get out at the same time.
Oh,
And so we in correspond. I write for this elderly couple to congressmen, and I write to Mitterrand, and I send telegrams to Margaret Thatcher.
Do you get any response from anybody?
There are responses. We've written to Campbellman. We've really exhausted every address.
But
they respond, and they said he'll certainly be put on the list. And
Well, is he a refusenik?
Well, the definition of a refusenik is really one that has been refused, that has applied and has been refused.
Right.
Permit to leave by OVIR. And as far as I know, as far as the elderly parents know, they insist that he's neither a dissident or a refusenik because he's never been refused. And he didn't refer to himself as a refusenik.
But has he
nevertheless,
applied?
They applied in '79 at the same time that the elderly parents applied.
And what excuse did they get for not being able to?
They just said, we are not ready for you yet. They didn't say no, they said wait, and to this day they say wait. That's as much of this. I think that at this point possibly he's, they're in, they talk to each other on the phone, rather the parents call him in Moscow. And what his present status is really hard to judge, because I don't think he would ever tell his parents that he's been refused, because they live in the hope that he wasn't refused, and it's just a matter of weeks all the time. There's some wonderful will happen, and that through some list or somebody's good word, somebody's going to talk to Reza or to Gorbachev, especially on the son's behalf, and that just, whether it happens or not, it doesn't do any good. So, having been fortunate enough to get out of Germany, and I can, feel so much the tragedy of separation.
You can really
of this
empathize with
elderly
them.
couple here who can only think of their child in their 80s and, not in a physical condition anymore to try to learn English or even in the mood to do such a thing. They can only dream of whom else to write to, and when they need to write,
You're there.
I'm there to write.
Are they despondent and depressed?
Well, they're very bright people, and they read the weekly Russian paper from New York, and we went out together to pick up a television for them, a new one. They did have it, but they're very fortunate in that they have each other, please God, for many years, and that they're able to.
Are they in good health despite the fact the woman is blind?
The woman is blind, and she is not in the best of health, and he also has a heart condition. But they manage somehow.
That's
they have each other,
story.
and it's a very
And
close
you seem
family
to be a
life.
good friend, a very good friend.
So that, that really makes you, number one, be very grateful to be in this country, and also very anxious to try to help somebody else, come into such good fortune.
As people say,
I don't think that those of us who came over can ever really forget what we escaped. It's still a miracle.
Everybody says who survived that if not for that miracle or that lucky happenstance, they would have been in the ovens.
Yeah.
Thank goodness that you were able to come here. Yeah. We have to wind up down now. Do you have anything that you want to say in summary?
I would just say that when families here have an opportunity, Jewish families, anybody who lives in the United States or in any free country has an opportunity at any time to help people get out, or to provide sponsorship, or to write letters, or just to send a greeting to people behind the Iron Curtain. It's a mitzvah, and they should do all they can, because usually things, I think, are worse than what's written in the paper. You never get the whole story, or you get the whole story when it's too late. So when we hear about the tragedy of the Russian Jews, it's something that is really
certainly relatable to what happened to the German Jews or to the Jews of Europe. Thank you very much, Marianne.
You're welcome.